the recording. So
And I'm going to share my
I'd like to
screen.
welcome everybody tonight to our third, and we're going to call it final, but for some reason, at least I feel like we're going to be connected for a while, managing through
Oh,
the
I would
post.
love to do more talks, just not about COVID, maybe.
Well, listen, and let's hope again, we're going to say, let's hope they're all live in our engagement together. So,
Yep.
So I'm Tara Sharvat, the Junior League of Summit president, and the Junior League of Summit is hosting this third-part mental health series with Dr. Elise DeMarco. And Elise, we're again thrilled to have you here. I'm really excited about tonight's topic, talking about post-COVID reentry and how to cope with fears about re-engaging with the world. I think we all are dealing with different stressors and different apprehensions about going back to what we think life was before. And really, it's probably what the new normal will be. So, really excited to have you here tonight to hear your words of wisdom. And, ladies, questions throughout the way, please feel free. Anybody who's taken Elise's, I want to say course, to share your words of wisdom, you've always been really open to questions, whether you just toss them out or you put them in the chat box. So,
Yes.
Elise, take it away.
Okay, great. Well, so I'm going to share my screen, and everybody can see, I hope, the screen.
Yep.
We're good. Okay, great. So thank you to the Junior League again so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to do these talks, and I feel like I've made a new friend in Tara after this is our talk number 6 that we've done. And again, our hope is that we can do more, but maybe not about COVID. Maybe that's something else. But I'm really glad today to be able to talk about post-COVID re-entry, right? Because it does feel like a more positive topic than we've had previously. And the good news is that there are some really great ways of coping with anxiety, dread, et cetera, about COVID reentry that we can use from, and learn from CBT. So I'm really happy to be here to talk about that. If you've seen any of my talks for the Junior League, you know all of this stuff. I'm a clinical psychologist based in Summit. I specialize in cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, for anxiety, with a subspecialty in helping parents navigate the stressors of parenting. And I'm the author of a book called Mom Brain, which is coming out soon on May 9th. And I have 2 boys at home, almost 7 and almost 10. And this is just a bit about my training and background. So I want to start by addressing an issue that I've been hearing about a lot from patients, which is this notion that we should be thrilled that normalcy is upon us. So I've heard from a lot of people that they feel weird, they feel strange, that normalcy is going to happen and we're going to get back to life, and they're not really feeling 100% great about it, right? And they're saying to me, well, I don't understand, like, we've been waiting for this for a year, right? Why am I not more enthused? And I actually think it really makes a lot of sense that we are not unequivocally thrilled to return to life, because we have basically spent a year avoiding everything, right? And in fact, COVID sort of gave us a blank check for avoidance, right? I mean, basically, we had no choice. The CDC told us we had to avoid everything. But avoidance is one of those things that we talk about a lot in CBT for anxiety, because avoidance is like, if not the main thing that maintains anxiety, one of the main things that maintains anxiety, right? And I'll give an example of somebody, say, who has some social anxiety around like a big, around big parties. So somebody who's socially anxious, who gets, nervous when they get invited to parties, if they decide, you know what, I'm going to avoid every party that I'm invited to, they're never going to learn whether or not they can navigate these kind of parties successfully. They're never going to learn whether or not they're going to be able to manage, right? So as a result, they're just going to keep avoiding and keep feeling anxious about parties, and the anxiety is going to remain, right? Avoidance drives anxiety, right? Because again, it cuts off any opportunities we have to learn that we can effectively manage a situation that we feel anxious about or that we're dreading, right? So once again, COVID made us all avoid everything. So there's issues for those of us who had anxiety pre-COVID about, say, socializing or germs or family issues or whatever, who were able to avoid all this stuff for a year and are now being thrust back into it. But there's also anxiety that has come from just not doing something for a year and then all of a sudden finding you have to do it again. I think one of the things that I've heard about actually the most, being someone who's based in Summit, is going back to commutes into New York City, where I've had a number of patients say to me, I used to be able to commute to the city, no problem. Every day I take the train, I take the subway, no big deal. But I haven't done this in a year. And now the thought of doing this fills me with dread, right? So again, this isn't something that made them anxious pre-COVID, but because they're so out of practice, they're now anxious and dreading it post-COVID, right? And I think that's true in many circumstances, right? We are out of practice, right? We haven't used a lot of our skills, particularly our social skills, right, in over a year. And so, of course, we're going to be rusty, right? So, for all those reasons, I think it makes a lot of sense that we're feeling in some ways quite apprehensive about the world reopening. And of course, we can't forget our kids as well, right? That our kids likely too are apprehensive, especially those who've barely been in school, who've been conducting their entire lives over Zoom. It's a big ask to get them to go back into normal social life. So I think it makes a lot of sense that we're nervous about this. The good news, as I was saying before, is that CBT offers a number of strategies that can really help us re-engage. The main strategy I'm going to talk about today, which is actually something I really haven't covered in any of these talks before, is exposure therapy and how you can use the principles of exposure therapy to help you re-engage with the world. I'm also going to talk about mindfulness and self-compassion and assertiveness. And these are kind of two things that you can use kind of in the service of your exposure therapy. They can help you with the exposure work that you're doing. But I'll spend kind of most of the time talking a little bit about exposure. Okay, so I'll start out by explaining exposure therapy a bit. If we were in person, I would ask everybody if they were familiar with exposure therapy. Some people would raise their hands, and I would ask, okay, what do you think exposure therapy is? And inevitably somebody would bring up spiders. Like, I feel like that's sort of the I don't know, the pop culture understanding of exposure therapy, that it's for people who are afraid of spiders, and they start by, seeing a spider across the room, and then they work their way up to a spider crawling all over them, right? But the thing is, exposure therapy is not just for spider phobia, nor just for phobias, but really can be used for anything we are anxious about or dreading and avoiding. Exposure therapy is sort of the anti-avoidance strategy. So anything you're avoiding is fair game for exposure. So the idea in exposure therapy is to kind of gradually and systematically expose yourself to things that you are anxious about, that you're dreading, and that you would really like to avoid, right? I'm going to do like a little sort of star or caveat to this to say that in recent years, there have been studies that show that exposure therapy doesn't have to be gradual to be effective. So in other words, if you're somebody who has social anxiety, right, and are worried about parties, in sort of old school exposure therapy, you would slowly work your way up, starting with smaller social gatherings. And once you've mastered those, moving on to bigger and bigger ones until you get to the party at the end. More recent research has shown that, like, if you're up for it, start with the party at the end and do a whole bunch of parties, and then maybe do some small gatherings and then parties again. What I've found, though, in clinical practice is that this is a really tough sell for patients. They don't want to do the thing they're most afraid of straight out of the gate. So generally, I still talk about exposure therapy as sort of a systematic and gradual process, even though, again, research suggests it doesn't have to be that way. The goal of exposure is, if you do something enough times, you gain confidence in your ability to manage it, right? You learn, oh, I can tolerate this situation, right? The situation that I've been assiduously avoiding, I can handle it. I can tolerate it, right? So again, to use the example of somebody who's afraid of big parties, big social gatherings, right? Maybe you go step by step, and maybe one of the steps is going into Starbucks and ordering a coffee or something, right? And you go into Starbucks as many times as you need until you feel like, you know what? I can handle Starbucks. I can do it. I feel pretty confident that I can get in there. Let me move to the next step on my list, right? Let me move to the next level in my exposure. To explain in a bit more detail how you could use exposure, I'm going to talk through some of the kind of basic rules. And here's the thing: you don't have to have an anxiety disorder to use exposure. You don't have to have a tremendous fear of something. You can use these principles even with things that maybe you're dreading, right? That you feel like are going to be hard to get yourself to do. So once again, you don't have to have sort of clinical levels of anxiety to be able to use these principles to your benefit. I think everybody can use these principles as they're kind of re-engaging with life. So the first thing you need to do with exposure, either with yourself or if you're doing it with your kids, if you're noticing that your kids are having some anxiety and dread, is spend some time just noting down any person, place, thing, etc., that you feel like you want to avoid right now, things that you're dreading, things that you're anxious about. And these can be general or specific things. So a general thing would be like going to the mall, say. A specific thing might be my friend's wedding in the end of August, right? So you can go general, you can go specific. And then you want to rank order these things according to how anxiety provoking they are, how much you want to avoid them, right? And what I should say too is if you have a specific task that you are really dreading, say this friend's wedding at the end of August, you can actually sort of design exposures to help yourself get to that, right? Sort of smaller steps to get you along the way to eventually work up to that wedding. So that's kind of another way you can structure an exposure list. The most important thing here is to make a specific plan for how you're going to carry out these exposures. So to use the example of the person who's kind of socially anxious, maybe she says, okay, the item on my list that I'm working on right now is Starbucks, right? I'm not going to the big party yet, but I'm working on going into a Starbucks and making some chit chat with a barista. I'm going to do that tomorrow at 3 p.m. That's going to be my first exposure, right? Now, the reason that I stress making a plan, and again, for those of you who've been in my previous talks for the Junior League, you'll know I talk all the time about scheduling and planning and how important it is. It's really important to plan exposures because otherwise you're not going to do them, right? Because these are things you're avoiding. These are things you don't want to do. So the best way you can, make sure that you're able to do these things is to decide ahead of time when you're going to do it and what the specific circumstances are going to be, right? It's really critical that you do that. And also, you want to repeat an exposure until you feel confident that you can manage whatever the task is. And then you move on to the next thing. So maybe you say, all right, I went to Starbucks. I was white knuckling it that whole time. That was terrifying. I got to go to Starbucks again. I'm going to make a plan on Saturday afternoon at 1 p.m. to go to Starbucks. Maybe you do it again and you think, oh gosh, this was still really, really anxiety producing. I'm going to try this again. And maybe you say, okay, now I'm going to make a plan. I'm going to do this Monday at 7 p.m. or whatever it is, right? And you basically repeat the exposure until you get to the point where you don't feel so daunted about the task, right? I should say that the goal of these exposure tasks is to complete them, not necessarily to enjoy them. And I think it's a really important point because here's the thing, you've been avoiding these things for a long time, right? So you've got to expect that you're going to endure a fair amount of anxiety or a fair amount of dread, especially the first time or two that you're doing these things. And listen, the truth is you may never enjoy these things, right? If, I've been talking with somebody about building up to commuting into the city again. And I was saying to her, you know what, like you could do lots of exposures and still hate commuting and still dread commuting, right? All that you need to do is build up your confidence that you can manage it, right? Because then it's not going to feel so daunting and then you're not going to feel like you need to avoid it, right? So really the goal is to finish these exposures and to do them enough times that you feel confident that you can manage whatever anxiety comes up, whatever dread comes up, whatever feelings come up. I should actually note something interesting that occurred to me personally recently. I, maybe 2 weeks ago, went to a friend's party that was outdoors, very safe for her birthday. And I was so excited leading up to this party because I hadn't seen this group of friends of mine from town for probably 3 months, honestly. And I was saying to my husband, I'm so excited. It was going to be a nice day. We were going to get out and I was really looking forward to it. And I got to the party and I'll tell you what, I was exhausted, like almost immediately. And the chit chat felt tiring and it felt like a slog. And I couldn't wait to get home. And I'm someone who loves being out and being social. And I was excited to see these friends. And I was like, wow, it was really surprising that I got there and I didn't want to be there. And again, I think this spoke to the exposure experience where I was out of practice chit chatting and I was out of practice being in social gatherings like this. And I found it a slog. And I told myself, you know what, I got to do this again, right? And I got to keep doing this. And eventually it will hopefully start to feel maybe even a little fun again, right? But the goal that I have in mind is just to do it again, not to necessarily enjoy it like I once would have. Okay. I want to speak a little bit to how to make sure that exposures don't work. Okay. So if you want them not to work, here's some good strategies. Number one, don't plan them out, right? Like I said before, if you're going to do these things, you got to be really planful about it, because you're not going to randomly on a weekend be like, I'm really anxious about going to the mall. I'm going to go to the mall right now. It's not going to happen. So you have to be really planful about what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. And the same thing is true if you're kind of shepherding your kids through an exposure experience, right? You want to talk with them about exactly what they're going to do and when they're going to do it. And of course, involve them in the planning if they're old enough, because that'll give them a sense of control and mastery, which is important. Another way to make sure that exposures don't work is to only do them once in a while, right? So this is like the example of someone who, say, is nervous about going to a large party. So they go to one large party, they white knuckle it, and they're like, phew, gosh, I'm glad that's over, and they never do it again, right? You're not learning much from that, right? It's one experience. It's very limited data, right? It's just data from one experience. Well, I did okay with that one, so I'm not going to push my luck. I'm not going to any more parties, right? The goal that you really want to achieve is to have enough exposure experiences and collect enough data so you can look back and say, all right, I went to a couple of parties this summer. How'd they go, right? Let me pool the data from all these parties, and does it tell me anything about my ability to navigate this kind of situation effectively, right? So you really need to do enough exposures to give you the data you need, again, to gain the confidence that you can manage. Another thing that I always caution people about when they're thinking in exposure terms is people will often say to me, you know what, like, I'll eventually, I'm going to have to be in this situation. So I'll just wait until I'm forced into it, right? This is somebody who might say, like, oh, I've got this wedding in August. I'm going to avoid socializing until August, but I have to go to this wedding. So I'm just going to push myself to do it, right? Again, if you're waiting for exposure opportunities just to pop up, you're not going to benefit from exposures, right? Exposure really needs to be thought through and planned out and repeated to be effective. Once again, you got to collect that data. It is often the case, actually, that I'm doing exposure therapy with someone with an anxiety disorder, and they'll say, oh my gosh, I inadvertently did X thing that's at the top of my list, by accident. And they'll always say, like, it was terrifying, never again, right? Whereas if they work their way up to it, by the time they get to that thing on their list, they're ready to do it. They're ready to tackle it, right? They have that confidence. So don't wait to be forced into experiences. Make sure that you're scheduling and planning these things. And again, I want to underscore that you don't have to be clinically anxious to do this. This can be for anything that you feel like you're dreading, anything you feel like your kids are dreading, anything that feels anxiety producing, because you want to get some practice, right? You've got to get some practice. And you also want to approach reentry in a gradual way. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I think the notion of embracing post-COVID life full throttle, I think it sounds good in theory, but I think it can be very overwhelming in practice for a lot of people, right? So once again, these principles are for anybody who's avoiding basically anything or dreading anything, once life reopens again. Okay. So now I want to talk a bit about mindfulness and self-compassion, and specifically how these skills can kind of support your exposure work. I've mentioned mindfulness in, if not all, then the large majority of the generally talks that I've given, because I think it's one of the most important skills that we can use to help us manage our feelings during this time. And specifically, mindfulness and self-compassion of our emotions, which basically means allowing ourselves to feel what we're feeling, right? And sort of making space and a place for us just to experience any emotions, good, bad, and otherwise, recognizing that this is a really stressful time, right? And that all these negative emotions are par for the course. Again, you guys have heard me say this before if you've listened to any of these other talks, but I wanted to stress it here because re-engagement may be very exciting, but it also might be very hard, right? As we've talked about, and we're talking about in the beginning too. And so you really want to be kind to yourself and aware that this might be difficult, right? And be mindful of your feelings along the way. not last time, but the time before, so a month ago, in the talk I gave, I recommended doing kind of a mindful emotion check-in. I think I might have called it like taking your emotional blood pressure several times during the day, which is a really effective way to make sure you're kind of keeping tabs on your mental health throughout the day. And very briefly, because I talked about it before, it basically involves a couple of times a day, either timing it with meals, or maybe you set your phone to go off every few hours. You just check in with yourself, right? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? How am I doing? And it's really important, like I said, to make sure that we're paying attention to our own mental health. And if we find that at any point we're starting to struggle, we can kind of put coping strategies into place to help ourselves manage. I think it's really important to do this as we're re-engaging with the world, right? Because it's going to let us know if at any point we're starting to feel overwhelmed, right? I think it's really critical that we all know our limits, right? That as much as we want to do exposure, again, exposure is gradual and we don't want to overdo it and we don't want to overburden ourselves and overstress ourselves, right? And same for for kids. So I think keeping tabs on our emotions is so critically important now, because it'll tell us if we're overdoing it and if we need to retreat for a little bit, right? If we need to kind of go back into a self-imposed quarantine for an hour or a day, or whatever it is, right? We really want to be mindful that this can be difficult and just be aware of how we're doing as we're going through our days. Don't overschedule, really important. And same for your kids, right? Like, we really want to make sure that we're mindful of our kids' feelings. I think many of us assume that kids are going to be so excited when everything opens up, and I think they will be, right? But they're still going to struggle with the same stuff we are, right? Their skills have atrophied too, right? They've not been in public life for a long time, right? So they too may have some anxiety and some dread, and so we really just want to be mindful of that, and keep the dialogue open with them about that too. Okay. I'm going to finish off by talking a bit about assertiveness. And I've talked about this topic before in kind of several different ways. Most recently, 2 weeks ago, when I talked about values, I was talking about how we can use our values to help us make decisions about what we're comfortable with and not comfortable with regarding kind of COVID precautions and decisions, right? I want to bring that up again because I think reemergence is going to create a lot of scenarios where maybe we are more or less comfortable with certain activities than, say, friends, family members, fellow parents, if you're a parent, and so on and so forth. This is going to happen a lot. And I'm already hearing about this from patients, right, who are like, even around like Passover and Easter, with some family members wanting to like get everyone together for the holidays and other family members feeling very leery about doing that and so on, right? So I think these things are going to keep happening. I've talked before, and I'll say it again, about the importance of assertiveness, about the importance of very clearly and very assertively expressing what you want to do or don't want to do in given situations, right? It's really important that you present, whatever your values are, and wherever you are kind of on your exposure list, you've got to use that as your guide. So I think I actually might have used the example 2 weeks ago of the woman that I was talking to who has a sister who's renting a beach house for like a week or two this summer down the Jersey Shore. And her sister values socializing and values family above all else, and is like, I can't wait. Everybody come to the house for like 2 weeks in July. My patient is a little scared, right? My patient says she's not sure that her kids would be vaccinated at that point, have vaccines, be given a vaccine at that point, vaccinated, there we go. I was getting there. And she's nervous, right? She's scared. She doesn't want to do that, right? And so we talked about how the really important thing for her to do is to very directly tell her sister in no uncertain terms, I'm not there yet. I'm not comfortable with that yet, right? And we talked about maybe she can offer some compromises, like maybe she goes down to the shore for the day with her family and they can spend some time outside, right? But she needs to communicate what her needs are, and she can't offer to negotiate, right? Because these are her needs based on her values and her comfort level. A really good strategy for this is the "it's not you, it's me" approach, right? Something that I've heard about at this point a million times from patients is that families have been fighting with each other, brothers with sisters and parents with kids, and also friends with other friends, because they'll have different levels of comfort around COVID issues, and they'll judge each other, right? Well, I think you're way too permissive. Well, I think you're way too restrictive, right? This is not the way to go here, right? Because if you are judging somebody for their COVID decisions, right, they're just going to respond to you with defensiveness, right? And your message is going to get lost. Instead, pull them out of the discussion. Don't even mention them. Just say, hey, I'm working on dipping my toe back into the waters here, but I'm not ready to jump into the deep end. So I'm going to skip the beach house, right? And again, you're saying nothing about them. You're saying nothing about their choices. You're just talking about yourself. And it's a really, by the way, this is an effective strategy, generally speaking, to ask for what you need, right? To not say anything about the other person, but just stick to what's going to work for you. But I think it's especially relevant here as people are going to be making a lot of different kinds of choices, right? And trying to pressure their relatives and friends, perhaps. I want to mention, I'm going to finish up so we have some good time for questions, because I know this is a particularly sort of fraught issue for people now. But I want to mention kid activities too. You know, I think as parents, we're really excited about everything reopening, right? Like I can say that after basically having a winter of doing nothing, the fact that like my sons are playing sports again is really cool, right? It's fun to have a place to go and they can run around and all that. But we don't want to make the mistake of saying yes to everything that's offered to our kids, right? Not only because that might not be the best move for our kids, right? Because once again, they too are having anxiety about reentry. It also might not be the best thing for us, right? So to spend a day driving, you know, your kids all over the place for a million different sports is going to feel really taxing right now after having not done that for a year, right? So you really want to be mindful when you're asked to have your kids participate in things. You really want to be mindful of what feels reasonable right now, what's reasonable for them and what's reasonable for you. And once again, you may have to assertively respond to another parent, you know, my kid's not ready for that, right? Or, you know, we're still kind of sticking around close to home. Or, you know, we'll get there, we're just not there yet, you know, something like that. So make sure too that you're not saying yes to every kid activity that comes your way, right? Because like I said, it might not be the right choice for you, and it might not be the right choice for your kids too. So with that, I'm going to finish the sort of talk portion. This is all of my information. If you want to reach out to me, please don't hesitate. This is all my social media and email and whatnot. So I'm glad to answer any questions you have. And I should say, not just about sort of the topic at hand today, but if you have kind of broader questions about anxiety of any form or variety, I'm happy to answer those too. So don't hesitate. And of course, thank you guys. And I'll stop my screen share now.
Thanks, Elise. Ladies, what questions do we have for Elise for tonight? This is no doubt a topic that's on all of our minds, all of our families' minds, our friends' minds. We were talking about this last night. We had a junior league event, which was a live event. I mean, it was just 8 of us outside at the brewery in Summit, and it was just so nice to actually be outside with people. We were distanced. It was nice to be together, but it came up like people were talking about having to go back to work. One of the women was talking about having to go back to work in the city. Somebody else was saying, oh my gosh, I'm a little bit nervous about how to deal with family. So I really appreciate all of your ideas and thoughts around this, because it definitely is top of mind. That is for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm just hearing about, I mean, like it's the main topic of conversation, I feel like, with patients now. It's been very interesting to be a psychologist during this time because, you know, patients' sort of main topics have really shifted as COVID has shifted, right? So it started out, everybody was just in crisis mode. Like, how do I survive day to day? How do I get toilet paper? How do I, you know, deal with my kids not being in school? And then it sort of morphed, like the summer, things were quieter. And then it kind of morphed into like decisions about the fall. Do I go back to the office? Do I send my kids to school and so on? And of course, now it's become this, right? It's become, how do I get back into this? And what do I feel comfortable with and what don't I? So I'm happy to answer any questions you have. And I can also, if you're interested and if you've seen previous talks, I can also review any of the strategies that we've talked about before. So I can talk a little more about mindfulness if you guys want. I've done some talk about sleep, right, Tara? I feel like in most of these talks, we've gotten at least one question about sleep. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. So don't hesitate. Throw something in the chat and I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have.
I was thinking about calling you last night at 3 a.m. as I was still awake. I thought, no, I'll wait until
You
tomorrow.
want to laugh? I was too. I was up last night. I want to say I had one of those nights. I was up from like 1:30 to 3. So you should have called me.
Yeah, listen. Now I know.
Right. There you go.
Yeah.
Which maybe makes me lose my credibility talking about sleep a little bit, but that's okay. We all have those nights. Do you want me to spend a little time giving a little like
I mean,
problem?
actually it would be helpful. For me, I started to get into that, like, I mean, for me, work has been insane, and I'm sure for other people on the call, it's nonstop, right? So it's always going, it's always happening. I don't feel like you have to have time to go to the bathroom. I mean, we've related to the fact that we both have contractors in our house at the moment, and I keep saying, "Oh, I have to go let the contractor in to actually get to go to the bathroom, to get 2 minutes to go to the bathroom." So it's been crazy. So sleep has been escaping me lately. So yeah, talk a little bit about sleep.
Okay, I'll do my quickie sleep primer. And if you guys have more questions, let me know. So I'll give kind of the basics. Like I think it's been a hard time for sleep, right? Just generally speaking, because everybody's more anxious, right? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to know that it's tough. And I always think about something my grandma used to say, which is I do my best worrying at night, right? Which I think is true for so many of us. And I think what can sometimes happen, like for me last night, honestly, I woke up at maybe 1:30, just had to use the bathroom. I got back into bed, and it all of a sudden in my head, I started thinking about a writing assignment that I'm working on, and I had trouble going back to sleep, right? So I think this is a thing. And the thing that I tell people, right, is that some sleep stuff, again, is sort of par for the course, but there are things we can do to sort of encourage better sleep. So I'll kind of run through the greatest hits of that. The first thing that we can do is really protect the hour before bed to make sure that we're just doing things that are relaxing. I really urge people to toss their phones during that time. And I get a lot of pushback about this from patients, but I think our phones are a real source of anxiety now. At the very least, they're a source of overstimulation, right? Because we've got a million apps and a million things popping up or whatever. But I think also they're a source of bad news, right? We're getting CNN news alerts. So I think phones in general are quite stressful. So I recommend protect the hour before bed, do something totally relaxing and mindless, whatever that might be, watching TV, reading, and so on. I also recommend keeping the same bedtime and wake time. People hate this because people are like, well, on the weekend, I want to sleep in. But I think whenever we talked about this last, Tara, which was maybe a month ago, I can't remember. I think it was a month ago. I think I made the point, and I'll make it again, that actually, if you're sleeping late on weekends, what you're doing is jet lagging yourself, right? It's as if you're switching time zones for 2 days and then expecting yourself to switch back to your old time zone. So actually, for better sleep, it really makes sense to keep a consistent bedtime and wake time, as punishing as that may be. I have to say that I ended up doing that because my kids forced me into that, and I sleep much better as a result because I'm waking up and going to bed at the same time every day. Also, be mindful of your bedtime and don't go to bed too terribly late. I'm aware that for a lot of us, evening is the only time that we truly get a break, that we're not working, that our kids are not in our faces, and so I get that that's really the time that you want to binge a show or, spend some time texting with your college friends or whatever. But I will say that will come back to bite you, right? Because you'll have a harder time sleeping, falling asleep, you'll get less sleep. It's, the quality of sleep won't be as good. So I really recommend, again, set a consistent, wake time and sleep time, protect that hour before bed. And then my last big one applies actually to what happened to me last night, which is if you're up in the middle of the night or if you lay down for bed and more than, I would say, 30 minutes max, usually CBTI, the CBT for insomnia folks will say 15 to 20 minutes, but I would say 30 minutes max. If you are awake and alert and like my grandma, worrying, get out of bed, go to a different room. I can't emphasize enough how important this is. And I get that it's comfy in your bed and I get that it's hard to leave bed. But that's the best way that you can ensure that you will be able to get yourself back to sleep effectively. So you go to another room, you do something totally relaxing and mindless. Don't go on your phone. Again, phones are stimulating. So maybe you put on old episodes of TV shows you've seen 1,000 times. Maybe you sit down with a comfort read, something like that. And when you feel tired, then you go back into bed. I cannot stress enough how much this helps to sort of minimize those nighttime sort of awake points, middle of the night stuff, and also helps with the early in the evening stuff. So that's my quickie sleep primer. But if you have more specific questions, please let me know. Oh, and I see a question now is in the chat. So let's see. One issue I'm finding that I have is my husband and I are both vaccinated, but obviously our 2 little boys are not. I'm in the exact same situation as you, Betsy, with my husband and I vaccinated and my 2 little boys not. I struggle with if I'm doing the right thing for them. I sign them up for sports, they're in school, daycare, but anything we do something with more exposure, I feel guilty that I'm putting them in a risky situation. I work for a healthcare system, so I'm constantly inundated with stats. Yes, I can relate to this so much. And I think what's really tough is when you are in the know, as someone who works in healthcare, sometimes it can be to your detriment, right? Because you're hearing all the bad news as it's coming, and it's sort of hard to parse that. It's interesting, the question about kids, right? And one of the people, I've mentioned her before, but one of the people that I highly recommend you follow, if you don't already, for really great science-based kid information, actually not just about COVID, but about everything, is this woman named Emily Oster, O-S-T-E-R. Some of you may be familiar with her books. She's written 2 and is actually coming out with a 3rd, I think, in August. One of them was called Expecting Better, I think, about pregnancy, and one of them is called Crib Sheet. And basically what she does, she's an economist based at Brown, and she does data-based parenting advice, where she is someone who will look at all the data, she will look at all the studies, and she will give you no nonsense, non-alarmist advice based on the data. She is a great source of information about kids and COVID. And I have found her work to be really comforting because, Betsy, I've been in the exact same situation as you, literally, down to the 2 boys. Both my boys are in school. They're both playing sports. My husband and I are both vaccinated. And there have been those decision points, right, where we're like, okay, well, are we pushing it if we do X, Y, or Z? I think there's no easy answer, but I think number one, it really helps to rely on the work of someone like Emily Oster, and you can follow her on social media. She also has a newsletter that you can sign up for that I highly recommend you sign up for. I think she comes out with it maybe once a week, and it's really good, as I said, non-alarmist, data-based COVID advice for kids. And I found her really helpful because her line right now is basically like, kids are at pretty low risk, right? And she'll give you the numbers and she'll show you the numbers and she'll tell you, obviously it's not no risk, but kids are at very low risk, right? And what I'd add to that is something that I tell patients all the time is the importance of considering the benefits and drawbacks of every decision you're making, right? So to ask yourself, all right, well, my kids aren't vaccinated, we're interested in doing X, trip to beach house with family, say. What are the benefits of this for them and what are the drawbacks? And not only what are the sort of physical benefits and drawbacks, but also what are the psychological benefits and drawbacks, which is a hugely important question. Because sometimes we're going to make decisions that maybe entail some physical risk, but we decide, what, the psychological benefits are worth it based on the level of physical risk. I may have mentioned this, I can't recall if this was for a junior league talk or not. But one of the decisions that I had to make last summer actually was about camp. So my son's summer camp was running, and a lot of camps weren't. And many of my friends were not sending their kids to actually the very same camp I sent my kids to. And I did a benefits and drawbacks analysis. And at the time, I looked at the risk and I looked at what the camp was offering in terms of safety measures. And I thought about the mental health implications and the fact that my sons were losing their minds, understandably so, because they'd been out of school and away from their friends for 3 months. And my husband and I decided, what, this is a risk we're willing to take, right? And we took it. And so I encourage you to again, seek out a solid source of information like Emily Oster, and then really sit down and make a case-by-case decision, as things are coming up. Think through physical and psychological risks and benefits for your kids and make decisions that way. But it's very complicated. And there's no, there's no right answer. I mean, I think in general, that's what's so hard about this, right? Is that like, there are no firm guidelines. And we've talked about this before in previous talks. So we really have to, make the choices that we deem are right for us and for our families. Thank you. That was a great question. Other questions, either about, again, that or about anything relating to anxiety or even the sleep stuff, I'm happy to answer. Or just a review of any of the skills we've talked about too. I can throw that in there as well, as this is my last go in this round. Tara, anything else you think people would benefit from hearing about? I mean, I know it's 8:45, but I'm happy to talk a little bit more if there's other stuff you think would be important.
I think this is our 6th moment together talking about COVID. And as we said, we hope we don't have another one talking about COVID. Is there any final words of wisdom that you can leave us as it's so close to feel like seeing the sunlight? I'm really heartened about the vaccinations that we're seeing and the ability to get out. I'm also fearful of seeing the numbers climb. So there's a lot of mixed engagements happening, but I'm curious if you can leave us with any final words of wisdom after all your amazing talks.
Thank you, Tara. I would say that I think I have to go back to the mindfulness piece of all of this, which is just that we all need to be just keeping tabs on our feelings and how we're doing, because there's so much that we've endured and so much that we will endure. I mean, we're close and we're getting there, right? But again, as we have spent tonight talking about, reemergence brings with it its own set of concerns. And so I think what's really important is that we're just keeping ourselves and our own mental health on our radar, right? Not overburdening ourselves, reaching out for help when we need it. Again, respecting our own boundaries and sort of assertively communicating what we need, right? Making decisions, like I was mentioning, making decisions on a case-by-case basis. And I think we have to continue to do that, right? Which is to, I don't think any of us at this point, nor at any time during this, have been able to unilaterally say, this is my stance. This is my stance on COVID. This is how I'm going to, interact in the world. This is how my kids are. We've had to go case by case, and we will continue to have to look at things in that way. So I think those are kind of my like wrap up thoughts. But like I said, in particular, being mindful of how we're doing, and to throw in something from a couple of previous talks that we covered, just making sure that we're continuing to take care of ourselves, right? And making sure that we're adding into our day things that are meaningful and rejuvenating and refreshing, because we need that. We need it. It's been a long haul. I think that's it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And ladies, any final questions or final thoughts? All right, with that, Elise, we'll close out for tonight, and we'll close out number 6 of 6. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you talking to us and really helping us through the journey of the last year.
Thank you so much for having me. I've so enjoyed meeting you, Tara, and getting to know you, and so enjoyed working with the Junior League. And again, guys, if you have any, you're welcome, everybody. And if you have any follow-up questions, concerns, anything, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm not going anywhere, as nobody is. So don't hesitate.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a nice night, everybody. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.